Welcome to AI for Good, the leading action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by ITU, in partnership with 40 UN sister organizations, and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. In today's session, we're counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished panelists and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Hi, good day, and welcome to the fourth session of the AI for Good Discovery Series on AI for Biodiversity. This series represents a partnership between the International Telecommunications Union, the Convention on Biological Diversity, NatureServe, and the Alexander von Humboldt Institute of Columbia. My name is Mike Gill, and I'm the co-curator of the series and also the director of NatureServe's Biodiversity Indicators program. And NatureServe is a science-based conservation organization operating a North American-wide network for the protection of species and ecosystems. Now, the intent of this series is to explore the intersections of AI and biodiversity knowledge and conservation, delving into the ways in which AI is transforming this field and the challenges that we face in terms of applying AI and machine learning technology in this area. Now, of course, AI is just one tool in our toolbox, but one that's accelerating leaps and bounds, as I'm sure you're all seeing in the news, but not just at the fundamental programming level, but also in how it's being creatively applied by smart people, creative people to address a number of conservation challenges that we face. As a member of NatureServe, I'm obviously pretty biased, but I'm constantly humbled and in awe of our very own conservation scientists who through dogged determination, creativity, and just sheer talent really push the boundaries on addressing and understanding conservation issues that we face. And one of those talented scientists is actually here today. His name is Dr. Gio Rapacciuolo, and he's the director of our applied data science. And his work involves leveraging emerging approaches in data science to support biodiversity conservation practice and decisions. And Gio obtained his PhD in biodiversity and global change from the Imperial College of London in 2013 and has over 10 years experience in computational ecology and ecological modeling and has published over 20 peer-reviewed journal articles. And I'm personally excited to hear this talk and learn more about Gio's work, where he'll be giving us an overview of the field of species habitat modeling and NatureServe's transparent and repeatable process for applying this modeling. And the process leverages human and AI collaboration to produce refined estimates of habitat for endangered species in support of species conservation and improved recovery efforts throughout North America. So with that, welcome Gio, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mike. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and be able to speak to you all about this very important issue. Important to me, but I think important to all of us as well. Hopefully, I'll communicate that over the course of this hour. So I'm going to dive right in. Given that this is a series on biodiversity, I think we're all on board with this point, but I still like to start my presentation by communicating just how crucial the importance of learning more about which species are imperiled and where they are, how important that truly is. And I like to start by showing how in 2021, the World Economic Forum ranked the biggest global risks to economies and societies by their likelihood, here shown on the x-axis of this plot, as well as their impact on the y-axis. And if we look at biodiversity loss, it's in the top right quadrant. That is among the most likely and impactful global risks to economies and societies. This didn't just happen in 2021. Every year since, biodiversity loss and the risk of ecosystem collapse is always among the top risks to our society. This year at NatureServe, we actually produced this report called Biodiversity in Focus, United States edition, and summarized the risks to biodiversity and ecosystems across the United States. I suggest you go look for it if you're interested in this. It's a great report. It looks great and provides a great summary of biodiversity in the United States. So what did we find? We found that 34% of plant species are at risk of extinction. 40% of animal species are at risk of extinction, particularly those associated with freshwater habitats. And then 41% of ecosystems are at risk of range-wide collapse across the United States. Let's now imagine that we're concerned about these figures and we have a mandate to conserve the biodiversity on a certain landscape. Let's imagine that we're managing a part of the landscape and that we are to try to understand how exactly we're going to do that. So this is Lincoln National Forest, which is just about 1 million acres in the south of New Mexico. And let's imagine we're the manager of Lincoln National Forest, and we have to figure out exactly what imperiled biodiversity is on the lands we manage and how we might go about managing it. There's really 5 questions we can think of to try and answer this question and understand what our responsibility is towards the imperiled biodiversity that we manage. The first one is we need to understand what it is. What are the animals and plant species? What is their life history? And how do we classify what we have on our lands? The second question is, where is it? Where exactly are the imperiled animals and plants located across the lands we manage? The third crucial question is, how is it doing? How imperiled are those animals and plants? And therefore, how crucial are our management actions? In addition, ideally, we would also like to know exactly what can we do about protecting those species and managing those species, as well as put all of that in the context of a changing environment and try to understand the potential trends in populations and distributions under environmental change. These 5 questions are the fundamental questions that we use at NatureServe to direct our work, and they summarize our overall mission. So here's Lincoln National Forest. Today, we're going to focus on the where is it part of this mission, right? So where are species of animals and plants that are imperiled? The outcomes of this work might be these. For example, we might find that on Lincoln National Forest, we have the cockroach bumblebee, which is a globally critically imperiled species as ranked by NatureServe. We might find we have a few other imperiled species. We have the Sacramento mountain thistle, which is the globally critically imperiled species as well, and it is threatened. Is listed as threatened on the Endangered Species Act. We also have Wright's marsh thistle, which is a globally imperiled plant and is proposed as threatened to be listed as threatened on the Endangered Species Act. A few more species, the Manzano mountain cottontail, for example. And what we can do, other than understanding what's immediately on the lands that we manage, is we can look at the broader context of the distribution of the habitat of the species and try to understand just how important Lincoln National Forest is for this species, given its broader distribution. This might lead us to generate insights such as these, and specifically identify the entities that actually manage the overall land that includes habitat for different species. So for example, here for the species that we had a look at, we can find out just who is managing the lands that those species occur on and have their habitat on. And we might find that for some of these species, like right smash thistle, for example, partnerships with private landowners are absolutely crucial if we are to successfully manage the habitat of the species. So how exactly do we get to these outcomes? And how does NatureServe go about its work in doing so? So we have to go back to the mid-70s when the NatureServe network was starting to come together in response to the Endangered Species Act. And in the decades that followed, a really amazing feat occurred, which is that every single state in the United States and eventually every province in Canada created an organization which we call a natural heritage program in the United States. And that organization was tasked with collecting crucial information about imperiled species of animals and plants in that state. So every single state in the United States, every province in Canada has essentially a center, a data center that collects that crucial information that we use to answer those 5 crucial questions. Today, when you put together all the data collected by each of those data centers, it's a really amazing resource at the level of the US and Canada. Today, we'll be focusing on the US and specifically the continental United States. And we have a really amazing data set on the occurrence of animals and species. So is this the end of the story? Unfortunately, it is not. One shortcoming of this data set is that unfortunately, we cannot possibly do field work everywhere at all times and sample the occurrence of animals and plants that are imperiled in all locations at all times. That means that although we have knowledge of certain locations where certain species of imperiled animals and plants have been found, in the gaps in between those locations, we don't quite know what might be going on at any one time. So it's a data set where there are unfortunately gaps in between known occurrences. And certainly some species are harder to find, they're harder to detect in the field than others. So we might be going out there and not finding them. That is not to say that they're not there. We just were not able to detect them in that given sampling trip. So we have to somehow make use of this data set to figure out exactly throughout the landscape where these species are. So there's more work to be done there. And you're all going to be excited to hear that this is where AI comes in. So we use this process called collaborative species habitat modeling. And that is using AI to connect this amazing data set of occurrences based on field data of animal and plant species that are imperiled with data on the environment and environmental variables like soil type, geology, climate, land cover that mostly come from satellites and remote sensing, but also other data sources. And we connect those 2 types of data via AI and our modeling engine and our infrastructure in the cloud to generate maps of the probability of habitat for a given species throughout the broader landscape. So now we have a wall-to-wall product that is actually performing a prediction of the probability of habitat continuously throughout the landscape. So there are no gaps here in our prediction. This is a model very similar to weather forecast models. And so you now have a prediction for every spot in the landscape, even though we don't have actual data everywhere around the landscape. Now, why is this a collaborative process, and why are we talking about AI-human collaboration? Well, we could stop here with the model predictions, but we know that AI is not perfect, and especially in this context, and there are a lot of uncertainties that could apply to our model predictions. So fortunately, around an HServe network, we have a whole network of species experts that know so much about these imperiled species of animals and plants, and they know exactly where to find them, which variables actually impact them, and truly know a lot about the biology and life history of those species. So what we do at this point is we actually carry out a very in-depth review of the outputs from our modeling, and engage experts in reviewing all sorts of aspects of the outputs of these algorithms. In addition, in some cases, and this is truly amazing, where funding allows for certain species in certain projects, we actually are able to ground truth the predictions of these models by guiding people back out in the field and going to sample in locations that our models predicted as high probability habitat. And so we're actually able to send people to verify if the species is actually there, which is very, very exciting feedback loop. And then obviously, once a species may be found again, we're able to now include those additional occurrences into this process, which is an iterative process, and back off we go, regenerating an updated model and carrying out this process again. So this is a continuous cycle and truly leads to the best available estimates of the distribution of imperiled animals and plants. I'm going to exemplify this process using this species, the Apalachicola false rosemary, which is a highly imperiled species. So it's globally critically imperiled as ranked by NatureServe. It is endemic to Florida, to a very small region in Florida. And it's listed on the Endangered Species Act as endangered. So that's the highest possible type of endangerment on the ESA. We started working on the species because the Fish and Wildlife Service contacted us and was in dire need to update the current distribution map that the Fish and Wildlife Service was using to carry out decisions, which was outdated and based on broad county boundaries. And so it really wasn't a very detailed understanding of its habitat. So we started collaborating on trying to refine the habitat map for the species so that decisions could be made in a more robust way and in a more efficient way. The first step was to engage the Fish and Wildlife Service and biologists from within the Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as around the NatureServe network, to try and understand the existing information for the species and all the data that we had to play with. So the first step is always partner engagement. Make sure we identify all the necessary stakeholders, all the relevant data sources. The NatureServe network provides most of the data, but it's not the only source of data that we should be looking at. And so we try to basically figure out everything that should go into this model and try and get a better understanding of what drives the distribution of a species. So in this case, we used data from around the NatureServe network, which you can see here in green. EOs are our element occurrences. They're the fundamental data type that's used around the NatureServe network. They're polygon based. They determine areas around the landscape that form a core part of the range of a species. And then we also use some Fish and Wildlife Service observations that came from the field, and the biologists provided to us as well. So we have two types of data in this case. At this point, we actually carry out some detailed review of the input data by engaging the experts that know best about these species in the field. So we have a process that uses this tool, which we call our model inputs review tool. And we enable people to navigate the different data inputs in an interactive mapping interface. And so not everyone has seen all data that we got hold of. And so they're able to try and get a better understanding of what's going on across the landscape, what kind of data we're proposing to use, and then provide us with feedback on whether they actually think we shouldn't be using all those data. Some of those are out of date or erroneous in some other ways. So we vet the occurrence data that go into our models. The second input is variables on the environment. NatureServe has assembled an environmental predictor library of over 300 predictors. They're at the 30-meter resolution for the most part. So we have a value for every 30-meter pixel around the conterminous United States. And there are things like distance to freshwater or mean coniferous forest. So aspects of the land cover, vegetation, hydrology. Water deficit is a measure of drought. So aspects of the climate. So we get hold of all these data. These are from openly available sources, NASA, the USGS. And so this is gonna provide the fundamental understanding of environmental variation around the landscape, which will go and correlate with the occurrence of species. We also ask expert reviewers to highlight which key aspects of the environment we should be thinking about when modeling a certain species. So actually we have a widget as part of our model inputs review tool that allows experts to select some of those variables and even rank them to let us know what they're expecting. If the algorithm is doing its job correctly and actually is identifying things that are most biologically relevant, they're going to be able to tell us what they expect to come out of our algorithm as the most important things that actually drive the distribution of a species. So we use this information to filter down the environmental data sets that we will provide to the algorithm in some cases, but also to ground truth what happens downstream. So as I was saying, we relate the species occurrence data with the environmental predictors within our modeling engine. And I'm about to talk a little bit more about what goes on in here. We use random forest algorithms to connect these two types of data. And our objective is to generate a map of that habitat probability across the broader landscape. Now, the output that we get is actually continuous output. Every single pixel across the landscape gets a probability of habitat. But we generally like to categorize this output into high, medium, and low habitat probability. We find that that's a lot more intuitive for the applications that these maps are intended for. And essentially what these algorithms do is they basically characterize environmental variation at locations where the species has been found to occur, and form this understanding of these are the predictors and these are the values of those predictors that identify occurrence of it across the landscape. And then what we do is we're going to use that algorithmic understanding to generate predictions across the broader landscape. And essentially these areas of high habitat probability, we think of them as areas that bear high similarity in their environment to areas where the species is known to occur, right? So even if we haven't actually ever been to that place, we can now perform a prediction on whether the species is likely to be there or not, or at least habitat for the species is likely to be there or not, based on how similar the environment is to areas where the species has been found before. This is important because, as I was saying, many areas are difficult to visit. For example, as it relates to private lands, sometimes we just do not have access to the lands owned by some private landowner, and actually we're just unable to go there to sample. So a prediction of whether the species is likely to be there or not is actually very useful. Let's have a look a little bit at the random forest algorithm as it relates to this context in a little bit more detail. So we have two classes of the species occurrence data, if you will, indicates the occurrence of a species, that the species is present, or the absence of presence. So this isn't real absence in that we will never know for sure that a species is completely absent from an area. It's just not being detected based on how hard we looked. So we generally call these non-detections, but let's think of it as absences for the purposes of this explanation. So we have presence and absence. And then we have data on environmental variables, as I mentioned, aspects of climate, soil type, and so on. So you can think of it in this tabular format. We have sets of ones and zeros for presences and absences. And then for each of those locations, we have some value of an environmental variable associated with that presence or that absence. We use the random forest algorithm to build sets of trees that use decision rules to split the data into presences and absences. So essentially, what the algorithm is doing is building a decision tree, and the tree at every node here across the tree is a rule that has used one of the environmental variables that it has access to split the data into homogeneous sets of presences and absences. So in other words, it's trying to identify which variables best split the data between presences and absences in a way that each rule here is determining the likelihood of splitting the set of presences from the set of absences. So for example, if we think of, this is exemplified here, if we think of temperature on this axis here, the algorithm will identify the level of temperature which best splits the presences on one side from absences on the other, right? So that might indicate that actually you're much more likely to get presences above a certain temperature, and below it, actually you're much more likely for it to be an absence. The algorithm is going to build a tree based on these sets of rules, using a random subset of the training set, as well as a smaller subset of all the variables. Not every single tree is using all of the variables it has access to. Actually, it uses many fewer than that. And we build a forest. So we're actually building many such trees. And each tree is making a prediction of which environmental predictors are the most important to designate presences from absences. The idea then of the random forest algorithm is that we're going to perform an ensemble prediction based on each individual tree. So all these trees are then being averaged together, and each tree is getting a vote in the forest. So each tree is saying, for this particular location across the landscape, based on my understanding of the data I've had access to and the variables I've searched for, I would predict this particular pixel to be a presence. We do this across all the trees we've built and tally up the votes to then calculate a probability of habitat for that particular pixel. The more votes towards a presence, the higher the probability of habitat. The more votes towards an absence, the lower the probability of habitat for that particular pixel. Essentially, what we get as an output is these types of response curves that highlight the probability of habitat for the species, which you'll find here on the y-axis, going from 0 to 1, as a function of how the environment varies. So we talked about aspects of the climate, for example, annual precipitation. For the species, you'll see that the algorithm has identified lower precipitation with a higher probability of habitat up to a certain point where increased precipitation actually leads to very low probability of habitat. So too much precipitation is actually not conducive to the occurrence of the species. We use these species-environment relationships to form a prediction of the probability of habitat across the broader landscape, regardless of whether we've actually been there or not and sampled in the field or not. And so we get these estimates of the probability of habitat across the landscape. This is our model outputs review tool, which we use to engage experts in the detailed review of our model outputs. So in this case, we're asking experts to look at the probability surface that's generated by a random forest model across the landscape. And actually, we ask them to play around with the way we categorize high, medium, and low habitat probability. They're able to reveal more or less of the probability surface. They are able to comment on whether they believe there actually is some under-prediction or over-prediction across the landscape, and provide us with detailed geographical comments on where they believe there should be more habitat and where, in fact, they believe that habitat is being incorrectly predicted. So they're actually able to find out about the most important environmental predictors that were identified by the algorithm and provide comments on that as well. So we can confront this directly with what experts had mentioned in the first place before we even starting any modeling. And so oftentimes they'll tell us, you know what, I think the random forest algorithm is hanging on to some predictive variable that's explaining variance in the data very well, but actually it doesn't make a whole lot of biological sense. And so perhaps you should consider removing it or trying to understand exactly why that is. Importantly, as part of this process, we actually ask reviewers to provide us an overall rating for the model itself and the map that's generated from it. And we actually use this rating to form an understanding of a semi-quantitative understanding of how good that model is and how much improvement is needed. I'm going to exemplify quickly this process that we have. As I mentioned, this is an iterative process. So actually, we build a model, then we get it reviewed, as I've exemplified, and then we'll try to address the comments that we got by updating the model, oftentimes, or updating the map, and then getting it re-reviewed and so on, right? So this is a feedback loop here between model building and model review. And this is how we iteratively improve what is the result of this modeling cycle. This is really what we call this AI human collaboration, if you will. And I'm sure there's many definitions of that. And and this is a pretty loose definition of it, but we really are getting experts to interact with the model output in a way that leads to much more robust outcomes in this context. So in this case, we received a review by the reviewer reviewing the first version of this model, saying, I think the model's doing pretty well, but actually I think you should be predicting a little bit more habitat to the northeast. I'll be interested in seeing what happens there. And so what we did is we added a watershed unit to the northeast there and actually generated predictions across a broader landscape and updated our habitat map that way. That was not truly updating the algorithm itself, it was updating output from the algorithm. But ultimately, one of the main outputs we're interested in are this map generated from the algorithm. So as you can see, the interesting thing about this semi-quantitative rating is that we can get one for every version of the model. And as we move from one version to the next, we're able to track the confidence that expert reviewers have in this map. And actually now we know that that there's back-in and there's buy-in from experts that this is actually the best available map for that species. We produce a lot of additional output on top of these maps. And actually, we have these automatically generated PDFs that summarize a lot of aspects of the model itself, the model inputs, the importance of the environmental predictors, as well as a lot of information on model confidence. We actually stamp every single model with an estimate of how confident we are in it and the types of applications that we recommend based on the confidence we have in that model. The model confidence is something that we set based on the quality of model inputs, as well as the type of review and the confidence in model reviews that we have gotten. As well as statistical performance of the model. So we do carry out a lot of model validation based on data. And so that comes in to our model confidence assessment as well. So for this particular species, what we then did is produce this refined estimate of its range across the landscape based on the species habitat model we generated. And as you can see, it's a drastic reduction of its habitat. This is now the map that we generated is now the map that the Fish and Wildlife Service uses to make decisions about the species. As you can imagine, it's leading to many more efficient decisions because now we don't have to basically consider that the entirety of a county is habitat for the species. And so it leads to much happier people and more efficient decisions because now we can designate the actual habitat much more closely. Why is this important then? Because once we refine the estimates of habitat much more closely compared to either the underlying field data, which, as we said, it tends to be incomplete, and so there are gaps in between data sets, or county-based maps, like the one that the Fish and Wildlife Service asked us to update. When we look at a refined estimate of habitat generated by such models, we're actually much better able to address questions and resolve conflicts between, for example, road construction projects that the Fish and Wildlife Service has to assess and has to enable or not to go forward. So you see here, every one of these lines represent a proposed road construction project. And if we were to assess potential conflict with the golden cheek warbler here, which is an imperiled species in Texas, if we were to try and make decisions as to the potential conflicts of these road construction projects with the habitat of the species, we would actually conclude based on a broad county-based range map that actually there are many, many more conflicts than there actually are when we make an assessment based on a refined range map generated from the types of models we've been talking about. So this is very important to reduce conflicts, to increase the efficiency of decisions, and basically is a win-win. Is a win-win situation for everybody. I've mentioned that oftentimes we're able to go back to the field to ground truth the output from these models, and this is a very, very exciting application of these models. So we thankfully have a network of folks out in the field, and I mentioned that unfortunately they can't sample everywhere at all times, but being guided by a model actually makes those decisions much, much easier in terms of where to go and where to spend time sampling in the field. We now have a model that is making predictions about how probable it is that we'll be finding a species there, given that there is high probability habitat. So we're actually able to design surveys. What you see here in the squares in green, you see predictions from the habitat model in terms of high probability habitat in green. And then you see the field survey locations in these black squares. And we've designed the survey based on the model output. And the survey is designed to potentially find new individuals of the species in areas of high probability habitat as predicted by the model, but areas that are far away from where we've found the species before. We also look for confirmation of absences far away where habitat has been predicted. So what you see here is the results of those surveys. We actually, in orange here, are the known localities, and then both the New Mexico Natural Heritage Program, which is our member of the Nature Serve Network, as well as the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, both went out in the field and tested the predictions from the model. And you can see here where these stars are indicated actually new areas where the species has been found thanks to the model, where we had no observations before. The truly amazing thing is that now we have additional data to calibrate the new version of this model, and we're able to update understanding of the species accordingly, and always make sure we have the best available understanding of the distribution of the habitat of this species. And it's a never-ending process, right? More predictions equal more field observations, which then equals a new model version, and so on. And we've built this process to be iterative and live, if you will. So we're able to really update these maps as new information comes in, and we're obviously working on making that more and more dynamic, but the ability to do that is there. So let's go back to Lincoln National Forest, and now we have refined understanding of where imperiled animals and plant species are across the landscape. And we know overall across their entire range what the stewardship responsibility is to various entities. So we're beginning to have a full understanding of what is occurring across the lands that we manage, how imperiled they are, so how they're doing, and move towards what we can do about it. One really cool thing is that we don't just necessarily have to be looking at those outputs individually for every species, but you can imagine that now for every pixel, we have predictions across a whole number of species, and we can try to understand things like, what is the richness of a given area across the landscape I'm interested in? How many imperiled species are here? And start stacking up the outputs from such models so that we get estimates of species richness now around the landscape. So what you're seeing here for Lincoln National Forest is actually estimates of how many such imperiled species are in a given pixel by adding up all the different outputs from all the different models. We can zoom out to the broader landscape and now look at US Forest Service lands across the broader landscape in New Mexico, and going further out still, the Western United States. And now we have a full picture of imperiled species diversity across the United States. And we can relate that with lands that we care about, as I mentioned, the US Forest Service lands. And this is a truly amazing map that we're starting to build based on thousands of individual species habitat models combined to identify areas across the landscape that represent aggregations of imperiled animals and plant species. Obviously, we think this map is cool because we produced it and we're very proud of it. But this map, which was generated as part of a project called the Map of Biodiversity Importance, it involved, as I mentioned, modeling more than 2,000 imperiled species of animals and plants across a variety of groups across the conterminous United States. We had some great partners, Esri, the Nature Conservancy, Microsoft, of course, the strength of the Nature Network and all our partner organizations as part of it. And we were able to generate this amazing map of the richness of imperiled species across the landscape. We think it's cool, but we're not the only ones because amazingly, for this kind of science, it actually made it into the New York Times. And we're still very proud of it. So we show the slide, but this is just to say that this is an important issue, and it really is rising to a level of importance and popularity. And we're very, very happy that it is the case, because biodiversity mapping is really rising as a priority, and we're trying to improve how we do it constantly. But really, it's becoming a crucial issue and a very, very exciting application of AI. I'll end by saying that what we're also able to do now is assist federal agencies and other partners with fully understanding what's going on the lands that they manage. And so coming full circle in terms of here's some land that you manage, what is there and what can you do about it, and how are things doing. We now enable folks by creating these types of interactive applications. We summarize all the information we have access to. So the element occurrences, that's the fundamental data type around the NatureServe network, the model predictions. And now we're able to provide a full understanding across the entire United States, so very, very broad landscapes of what's going on within given jurisdictions that people care about. And so we've answered the question of where are animals and plants, and we did so using AI-human collaboration. I thank you very much. This was the last slide. I'm going to stop sharing here. Please feel free to get in touch if you have any questions about this work. It was a real pleasure to be able to talk with you today. I'm looking forward to the discussions. But thank you so much for having me, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gio. I certainly enjoyed that presentation. You really profiled the sort of importance of this work, but also the immense challenge that we have, and how AI can sort of strengthen and streamline that. And not surprisingly, there's some great questions coming in. And I mentioned to you before we even went into the session, often in these sessions, we get some AI experts that are listening in and come with some perspectives that maybe we hadn't even thought of. So some of the questions are a little bit along those lines. So I'm just going to take them in order, and we'll see how many we can get through by the top of the hour, but we can also follow up on the neural network after. So the first one, Gio, is from Jacob. And he asks, have you considered using chatbot large language models to streamline getting domain knowledge from experts?
We have not done that. And I think we have actually, this is a very interesting point, because we have actually not really explored AI to digest what's coming from experts. That part of the question, actually, we're not necessarily using AI to work on. And that's a little bit by necessity and capacity, but a little bit because we're just starting to get to grips with what that type of output is. And so I'll say at the moment, we're probably limited on the amount of data that we could use to train something like that. But certainly it's a great question. And it's something that we should definitely consider more moving forward as we build more and more history of reviews and are actually now able to get some kind of data set that we could be training some algorithm to help us understand.
Great, thanks.
Read your question.
Yeah, thanks, Gio. And another one that's come in really is trying to get at what's the sort of effort and cost savings. So if you hadn't applied random forest algorithm to train these models and process all that data, and even also just have a more efficient way to target people in the field to look for presence or absence. Here's the question. So in terms of time, I was wondering how much this process cost, especially with experts reviewing and giving feedback. So of course, it's not just run through a computer. There's a collaborative process that goes forward, but also can AI be applied for biodiversity as a solution for saving time? How much time do you think you saved considering a process that did not use AI, or was time not an objective in the process?
Yeah, it's also a really great question. And I think I personally wish we were better at quantifying these types of metrics of how much we're saving here, because that would be a very, very compelling thing to communicate. It's a little bit difficult. So I can speak a little bit to the timeline, the process of generating a model, getting it reviewed, generating a new model version and more reviews and so on. Generally, we run these kind of processes on a cycle of 6 months to a year. That's not accounting for going back in the field, right? If we were to do a field season as well, that would probably take up to 18 months to a couple of years. So it's not a fast process. Obviously, we could generate models much more quickly than that. We're doing it for many, many species at the same time across different projects. And so there is definitely a capacity issue there for us. The biggest time savings should be quantified in the application of these models. And again, we have some estimates of what came out from the field based on model guided fieldwork, and that should be compared to fieldwork that was not model guided, for example. Those are the kind of metrics we could be getting to. We don't have those values of time savings, but I think, again, that's something that we can move towards, and we really should, because that would be a very compelling thing to provide to potential donors or to really get people to care. So unfortunately, I don't have firm figures, but there's no doubt efficiencies there that are improved by the use of AI and the production of these maps.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Gio. Yeah, tough to quantify, but perhaps important to do so. Maybe a question from me, actually. So, as you know, most of my work and my team's work is in countries outside of the United States, and often in parts of the world that would be considered perhaps a little bit data poor. So, you know, we're talking about applying this approach in the conterminous United States using NASA and other sort of environmental predictor variables and you know, reasonably decent species occurrence data. Of course, it's never good enough. Can you speak to sort of whether there's a threshold by which if you're below that in terms of amount of data, that you probably shouldn't be applying this technique yet, or is it one of those things where you can apply it in any piece of real estate on the earth and kind of improve on as you build that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and by no means is this is this approach limited to the United States or any particular area. I mean, it's a fully transferable approach, and in fact, and it has been used for many years. I don't mean to sort of falsely represent the novelty of the techniques that are species habitat modeling. We apply it in a novel way through this collaborative approach, and certainly we're using cutting edge approaches. The way that species habitat models are run has improved over the years. But actually, when you go back to the origin of these approaches, they were actually being used to identify potential locations of very, very endangered species in often tropical areas that had very little data. And so actually, they were being used to identify potential new field locations for species that very little was known about, and mostly in tropical locations. So, and that continues to be the case. So actually, there's random forest algorithms and other algorithms, other machine learning algorithms, or other statistical techniques can be really, really good at making use of very little data for certain applications. To me, the key is, what is this output conducive to, right? So if it's to identify new field locations, you can actually use very little data. If it's to make a decision about whether there's a conflict between the habitat of a species and a potential road construction, that the bar is a little bit higher. So you're going to start to need more data there. And that's where we try to provide these estimates of model confidence, which quantity of data is sort of one of the things that determines how confident we are in a model. So absolutely can be used anywhere for many, many applications based on very little data. But I think we have to be careful about exactly what we end up using those outputs for.
Sure. Yeah. So basically, transparency is key, like it is with any modeling process, to be honest about what our limitations are. But perhaps we can use these as sort of, for lack of a better word, a virtuous circle where you sort of incentivize further field data collection in a targeted priority approach. And so on that issue of transparency, maybe another question that's interesting one to come in, but how often would the expert review that comes in sort of say to you that this is wildly wrong? So how often does the model just spit out garbage, and over time, are you seeing that sort of situation decline in frequency?
Yeah, we're very conscious of this issue, as you can imagine. I mean, for better or worse, it reflects badly on us if we share something with experts that is wildly off. So we really try to avoid those situations. We perform a first review ourselves and have in-house experts as well, zoologists and botanists, that we run the output towards. So like friendly reviewers, if you will. Everyone's a friendly reviewer, but even friendlier reviewers in the family, if you will. And so it has happened. I mean, there are a number of decisions that could lead to output that's certainly off, if not wildly off. One of the situations I mentioned is that random forest is very, very good at hanging on to things that apparently have very high predictive value and do from a statistical point, but actually don't make truly biological sense. And so when you're predicting beyond your training data set and going across the broader landscape, oftentimes you're might overpredict quite a lot because the algorithm actually identified something within your training data set that was very highly predictive, but not actually very biologically relevant. And so you do end up with a prediction of much more habitat than there should be in areas that there shouldn't be. One common example is the connection with roads. Oftentimes, a lot of our field data is by necessity is correlated with roads because those are the most accessible areas, and oftentimes there's roadkill and things like that. So there's a bias and a connection with roads which we know about and try to remove, but oftentimes the algorithm will still hang on to roads as a predictive thing. And if you predict it in the broader landscape, it's basically going to show you a map of roads. Those are the kinds of things that we look out for. But sometimes it does come to before the eyes of reviewers, which will take us to task and let us know about it. They certainly don't pull any punches, and that's why we ask them. But yes, I think we have to be ready for those kinds of discussions. And I think over time it is getting better because we anticipate those situations before they occur and try to do something about it before we ask reviewers.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, I think that, it really points to the human in the human AI collaboration. You can't pull that away or else it gets a bit dangerous, doesn't it? And I think about that paper that was published a couple of years ago that looked at the global biodiversity information facility data. So what we call GBIF global data, and the vast majority of it was within, several hundred meters of a road. So there's all that bias, and there's a reason for that, but we need smart people like you and others, subject matter experts, to be able to identify those potential biases that might be sort of drifting the model in a direction that's erroneous. I think we have time for one more question. So another one that came in, great presentation. Previous presentations have also shown the data potential of citizen science observations. What are your thoughts, Gio, on integrating that data into your models?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we often do already. I didn't really mention it. I didn't have time to go into it. But we often do. I mean, citizen science data ultimately provide just the same information as expert-based nature serve network data. I'll caveat that a lot of people are going to be mad about me saying that. What I'm saying is the fundamental information captured by a citizen science observation is fundamentally the same. There's something, what is it? Something is being identified. So that identification could be better or worse based on who was making it and how expert that person was. But oftentimes there's evidence via a picture of what it is. So we have to identify what it is, but it's possible. So that information is there. Where is it? So there's some GPS coordinates as to what was where. And then there's a timestamp for it. So you know how current those data were. We have all the information we need to be able to integrate that within our process. And so we often do. We'll do it more frequently with species that are a little bit less imperiled and a little bit less well tracked by the nature serve network. So there are a lot of species that are a little bit more common, but still could potentially move towards being imperiled. And those are the species where citizen science really is key, because you have a lot more eyes on the ground and you're able to use generally a lot more data. And so for those species, it really is crucial. The downside is the data are less well vetted, and there's a lot of observations in areas that aren't core habitat for the species. So you have to make sure that you identify those, because otherwise, as you can imagine, you can end up throwing your algorithm off by including a lot of habitats that aren't actually core habitat for the species. And that's why when we have sufficient data, we tend to prioritize our expert-based data, because we know that those are vetted areas that are core parts of the habitat of the species, whereas citizen science data is everywhere at all times. Could be someone's backyard. We try to, make sure that isn't. Not that there couldn't be any core habitat in someone's backyard, but you know what I'm saying. It could be often roads, as we say, and iNaturalist and eBird have a huge road bias as well. So there are, those are highly biased data sets overall, but we just need to know about the biases, try to control them, and otherwise there are amazing resources which we do currently use and increasingly will continue to use, because they absolutely are a necessary complementary data source to what are otherwise expert-based field observations. So yeah, very, very great question, and we're really excited to continue to use them.
Great, thanks, and well said, Gio. And again, thanks so much for your time and for such an interesting and well laid out presentation. For those of you that can stay on the neural network stage, we'll join that for another 20 minutes or so if you have other questions for Gio. And just a plug for the next session in the AI for Biodiversity series will be scheduled for June 5th, where we'll learn about how AI is being used to strengthen law enforcement, and particularly anti-poaching efforts in protected areas. So tune in and watch for that scheduled talk. Thanks again, Gio. Wonderful. Look forward to learning more as we go.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mike. Thanks everybody for joining. And please feel free to get in touch if you have any more questions.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learned something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the eShop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for Good.
AI is a powerful tool.
This summit can help ensure that artificial intelligence charts a course that benefits humanity and bolsters our shared values.
Mm-hmm.